Chapterr. Sublimation. Kleio got a room all to herself, worthy of a princess, and almost as big as the tent she had to share with hundreds of people. Felt to be 1,000 times the dimensions of the black box. Briefly, she thought of all the people who still had to stew in the camp. The thought passed through the four-poster bed, with the embrace of a down pillow. She snuggled against the blanket, wonderfully fresh bedding, and longed for the snow-white sleep that would make her forget her worries. If it had not been for the matron. With a clearing of her throat, she made herself known at the door, and stared at her like an intruder. The piercing look spoke the verdict. Only clean girls found shelter in her beds. Kleio rose ashamed and apologized. The matron remained at a loss for words. The verdict was spoken non-verbally. Room and beds belonged to her jurisdiction. Dirty girls to someone else's. A whole storm troop of maids fell in, and were all over her on cue. They circled Kleio like a giggling whirlwind, circling her so that she felt almost dizzy. They tugged at her, dragging her along the corridors of the mansion to the showers. Uninvited, the girls began to undress her. Kleio no longer put up with their childish silliness. She broke away from them and announced,
"I am quite capable of doing it myself."
Whether it was because she said it impeccably in their language, or did it with such determination, the way she looked at the door, she made it understandable that she wanted to shower alone and unattended. And the hens scuttled away, clucking, for the moment. The shower helped only a little against her exhaustion. There, the bustle already contributed more to it. Directly, they dragged her into the next room. In the second step of her optical rehabilitation into society, she landed in the hairdresser's chair. A lady with thickly applied makeup came in and intended to do the same to her what she did to herself this morning.
"Not too much, please."
She politely instructed the lady, but she completely ignored her request. Never before had she put on such war paint, so that in the end she couldn't decide whether she looked like an Egyptian goddess or an extremely convincing drag queen. She was spared the decision, which one it rather was. The girls took her to the tailor immediately. For the next few hours, he took her measurements, made adjustments, and hemmed his profession to her body. Now, the maids were unabashedly looking at Kleio. She felt like she was on display. They were constantly exchanging information among themselves. This outrageous whispering. One could have thought that little else exciting was happening here, so fascinated were they by this foreign body. Kleio thought that they must have better things to do. They did not disturb directly. She just wanted to avoid that the girls got into trouble because of her. Ended up in a box or something.
"Have you all been ordered to assist me?"
She asked, and they stayed true to the giggles.
His Eminence gave us the afternoon off. We've already been able to perform all of our duties for today. He has entrusted us to escort you until the feast.
One confessed. So they had to stay for her sake.
I'm sorry about that.
Kleio apologized. The girl smiled.
Don't be. You see, we are capable of entertaining ourselves.
Kleio stifled the joking question of whether that was why they were so intent on watching her shower. A little eternity later, the ball gown fit like a glove. It was too extravagant for her taste, but it was in keeping with the Laxarian, nearly Baroque style of the upper class. Her upper half was laced into an intricate corset. Ornamented layers of white and pale blue silk clung against her skin and ran in ruffles at the tips. The lower part was wide cut and dragged across the floor. It might have been completely impractical and overdone. Yet, she somehow liked herself in it. Even though the corset already ensured that it was she, more than the onlookers, who was left breathless. In addition, the tailor made a matching scarf, for which Kleio did not have to keep still. She got some rest and was allowed to go to the garden with the maids, not far from the backyard. She still lacked the understanding of the cultures in this strange parallel world, but all in all, she doubted that the building and the art in it were of Laxarian origin. Rather, an aura of the forbidden escaped everything. Pagan, or as the Laxarian said, heretical motifs of bulls, snakes, ravens, dogs and other animals were carved in stone or painted on it and stamped in metals. Little with the writings of Icebat, which were recited in the masses. The garden also exuded this atmosphere. Every spot here had been cultivated until recently, an overgrown patch of earth that resembled a maze. She could only guess how wide and winding the garden might be. From the street, nothing of the greenery was to be guessed. Back here, the dimensions of a park were revealed. Apart from the statues, she noticed the herbaceous beds in particular. They were marked with signs on which she made out moons and other symbols, not at all in the spirit of Icebat.
The Tauredians kept track of moons and times for the cultivation of their crops.
The maid suddenly spoke to her. That one seemed the bravest among them. The others stood apart and whispered.
Then Tauredians lived here before?
Kleio wanted to know. She nodded.
They were dispossessed after the army entered Kaltoin. An important family of the Tauredian nobility had stayed here before.
Kleio looked thoughtfully at the ground, pondered what might have happened to this family, and came to the only conclusion.
If they're still alive, they're probably in a hole like I was. I no longer,
she thought, doubting that the family in question had also been blessed by good fortune.
They were shot.
The girl enlightened her, revealing the fate relatively unmoved.
Did you know them?
The maid shook her head.
We were all born on Laxarian soil, and arrived a few months ago with our master on the West Tauredian coast. From there, we followed the front further inland. We changed locations several times since the beginning of the Laxarian conquest, in order to stay close to the front line. They were members of the Whitsons, the greatest heretics among their kind. Their existence was an insult to Icebat and the one god.
She spoke as if from one of their sermons, and struck the sign of her saviour Icebat in the air. Once again, Kleio became aware of the extent to which every link in the Laxarian machine was being oiled with propaganda. Just in time, the tailor finished with the shawl and called her over. The rest of the processes were systematic, precise and mechanical, as in a Laxarian clockwork. After making the final corrections, the final stroke, Kleio was summoned to the reception. At the entrance, she joined the party, as much as possible in the background, which was impossible to manage in her outfit. As the only woman at the front, she stood on a silver platter, next to clergymen and heads of state, which amounted to the same thing among the faithful of Icebat. The banquet hall behind was decorated with Laxarian banners and effigies of Icebat in gold, ruby and lapis lazuli. Tables were covered with exquisite dishes, Tauredian artifacts concealed in the best possible way. Accompanied by a Laxarian escort, a column of limousines drove up and unloaded the high-ranking guests. The strangers had to reluctantly hand over their weapons at the entrance. The distrust was mutual. It was covered up with superficial friendliness. Hundreds of soldiers secured the entire area within a radius of at least 20 blocks. No one without the proper authority or army behind them could approach the scene of their meeting. Tonight it became the political stage of this world. And Kleio, she represented in this snapshot the wrong side of the local history. In front of the scenes, she gave herself to the spectacle and received the arrivals. First, officers and generals of the Laxarian armed forces arrived, in fancy uniforms with sparkling medals, some with wives or mistresses, should their wives not have made it to the front. The only Tauredians at the banquet followed, the clan of Akavia, traitors to their own kin. They were minions of the Laxarian Empire and had already ensured before the beginning of the conquest to weaken strategically important Tauredian institutions with their economical and political influence. Thereby, they simplified the Laxarian advance, as the Geov had described it to her. Looking at them in this way, one hardly got the feeling that they were ashamed of it. Rather, they were surrounded by an almost toxic aura of self-absorption, especially their heads, the pair Magda and Kusales Akavia. Kleio had a hard time believing that kin meant nothing to them. They looked so much alike. They had to be related to each other through several degrees. Before Geoff 4, they were completely behind the Laxarian cause. Kleio hoped her own acting was a little more believable than theirs. The appearance of the out-of-town guests dispelled the empty platitudes. First, the delegation from the land of Lisbia, from the southern half of the continent of Sacria, which was called something other than America. Diplomat Mutlal Olumti, accompanied by the Lisbian actress and diva, Shima Kokitl. Elegantly, she stepped onto the stage and into the spotlight, in a long evening dress of rose-colored silk, was adorned with delicate copper chains and feathers of birds of paradise. Traditionally, Mutlal appeared just as colorful, even more revealing and more feathered than his style icon. As a gift, their entourage brought the Kolagat clay pots filled with black soil and exotic seedlings.
Mutlal,
Greeted the Geov,
I see you are planning to put down roots here.
which was meant to be a dry joke that his counterpart did not understand, seriously replied.
I bring you a piece of nature of our homeland so that its roots may connect us.
Please don't start with that, Your Eminence.
Shima said indignantly. She lacked understanding for his green thumb.
What are you desiring, my lady?
Asked Geov.
Well, despite everything, we hope to celebrate the premiere of our new play in Taured soon.
She said expectantly, which disgruntled his eminence.
The time for amusement and spectacle will come again as soon as the Laxarian capture has been completed.
Then this gives you no pleasure, Your Serene Highness?
This meeting is for diplomatic relations. The Kolagat acts only in the interests of Icepat.
Hardly did he see the same double standard in that as she did. His faith legitimized everything.
Of course.
Replied Shima with obvious doubt, before the lesbians gave way to the next guests. One stepped forward, possessing the mass of three. Kleio could not recall to have ever seen such an immense specimen of our species, if he could still be counted among them. He seemed to be made of muscle and just about fit through the doorway. His face was completely hidden by an eerie anthracite mask, and not a hair was on his body. His steel torso was bare. Tattoos of stitches and scars, his wardrobe consisted of a loincloth. His movements were sluggish, like those of an undead from a Romero strip. Inhuman, as if he had been sewn together like Frankenstein from corpse parts, and then revived with a rite. The enchanting woman who came out from behind him. After her bodyguard stepped aside, her magic came to light, an unearthly beauty. If Kleio had previously made the comparison between herself and an Egyptian goddess, she now wanted to leave this title to her without a fight. She was the embodiment of an Isis, a queen of Sheba or Cleopatra, Ea Tamrat, envoy from the kingdom of Al-Kebu. As a necromancer, she interacted with the dead, traded with the underworlds of her faith and their inhabitants. She wore a long silver-white and sleeveless evening gown of silk with stripes of turquoise and purple. Her black hair was cropped short and streaked with a mixture of ash and silver dust. Besides the giant, whom she called her bodyguard, other things about her seemed morbid. For one, she led a pet on a chain like a dog on a leash. The best friend of this human dragged ponderously beside her, a 2.5-meter-long crocodile with a leather muzzle. Around her left arm coiled a snake that she wore like living jewelry. There she also led the silver scepter, carried it proudly in front of her. A human skull lay impaled on the tip. Its eyes glowed with a ghostly fire. To let her into Laxarian halls was actually an affront to Icebat, but these were not Laxarian halls, merely those of which they pretended it to be, the same way they could easily pretend to accept her. The distant greeting of Geoff was to be expected. He tolerated her presence for political reasons.
And who is this pretty thing?
Asked Ea, intrigued. As she turned to Kleio,
My niece.
Geoff fibbed.
Of course she is. Good looks run in the family,
Ea replied with a touch of irony, and stepped closer to Kleio. The latter tried as much as possible not to stare at the skull, but Ea noticed all the more how much she avoided the sight.
May I introduce my honored grandmother to you? My most trusted advisor.
Kleio looked around a bit, but didn't see anyone who corresponded to her idea of a grandmother.
Here she is.
Ea spoke, pointing to the tip of her scepter. The grinning skull.
Ah,
Kleio replied, trying to keep her composure.
delighted.
To this she executed a curtsy, whereupon Ea burst out laughing.
Silly.
She said, amused, equally enraptured.
She is long dead.
Oh,
Kleio replied, feeling herself blush.
I could see that already.
Ea was visibly entertained. She held the tip of the scepter with the skull right next to her flawless face.
Can you see any resemblance?
You have similarly high cheekbones.
Shot out of her spontaneously, which further amused.
I think we like you, don't we?
She moved her ear closer to the scepter.
Yes, I think so too.
Either she was translating the words from beyond or voices in her head. For Kleio, it ended in an eerie message one way or another.
She sends her love and tells you to take care of yourself, Kleio. I'll see you around.
She winked and left it hanging in the air, like a self-fulfilling prophecy, then simply walked away.
When did I tell her my name?
Kleio wondered. Couldn't tell. The most disconcerting impression did little to change the fact that she already liked the out-of-towners better than the Laxarians. Even the last guests to enter. They came from the Eastern Great Empire, as well as the strongest Axis power in competition with the Laxarian Empire, Shenhuan Khan Chao, or the Celestial Empire of the Shenhuan Khan. Alchemist and scholar, mystic and astrologer, and personal advisor to the Khan, Jin Fa Shuo, a gaunt man in a golden silk robe. His beard reached almost to the ground, made of 9 braids tied together with pearls. With his twirled moustache and braided ponytail, he looked like a barbarian kung fu master, wrapped in silk and furs. His watchful gaze stood out as he inspected everything in the room, repeatedly squinting at an object held horizontally in his left hand. It resembled a compass, and he oriented himself by the needle before he was satisfied with the orientation, and he decided to take notice of the hosts. Behind him followed a whole group of beautiful women, innocent, almost doll-like in their kimonos. Wouldn't they have had to surrender their swords? All of them bowed to each other, and Kleio imitated their gesture. As with the envoy from Al-Kabu, they met with distance. They were not holding a diplomatic event here, but a demonstration of power. After the last guests had arrived, the party moved to the ballroom for an aperitif. Entertainment was provided by a chamber ensemble. The pieces they performed reminded Kleio of a peculiar blend of classical and folk music, with the weight of a swan song. Certainly it was difficult to dance to it. Not that the necessary mood arose among the Laxarians in the first place. Their music created the atmosphere for mutual exchange. Kleio had to attend all of it as an appendage of the Geoff. She heard the gossip of the upper class, how they made contacts, and even intrigues. Laxarians seemed to act only out of calculation and self-interest. At some point, it became too much for her, and she wanted to get away from it, if only for a short while.
Would the gentleman excuse me for a moment? I have to go to the bathroom.
She couldn't think of anything else to get out of it. Just a tried and true trick. It had gotten her time off before, for less valid reasons. It was permitted to her, and she immediately glided away on her high heels, past the guests in the direction of the restrooms. All the way, she felt the urge to vomit, but the nausea subsided as soon as she got there. She looked in the mirror above the sink, washed her face, if possible, without getting rid of the mask that had been painted on her that evening, forcing her to put one on. Split, she looked at a strange person before the mirror, with an expression of pity or gloating. Her mask, it consisted of not showing any emotion, otherwise she would have screamed. A lady was forgiven if she took her time. Instead of going to Giove, Akavia, and the henchman, she decided to go to the bar, with the intention to find the perfect dosage between what didn't get in the way of her continuing role and what made this occasion more bearable. Unfortunately, the bartender's repertoire was completely unknown to her. Therefore, she ordered his recommendation and, if possible,
Something that suits me.
the result turned out to be sweeter than she recognized herself in it. Notes of anise, a gin-like hint of juniper and honey, met an indefinable tide of fruity aromas. In this respect, he had correctly judged her character, Kleio decided. She mentally toasted to that, and equally to that it would not remain one.
Just don't overdo it, girl.
She vowed to herself. A long sip later, she took the glass away from her face when someone stood in front and examined her. Ia, envoy from the Alkabi people. Contrary to her gloomy fashion taste, she made a sympathetic impression. Her grandmother could not be blamed. For her age, she looked quite passable.
Where did you actually learn your alchemy?
She was keen to know.
I
She pondered, looking into her drink to do so.
learned a good education.
You actually did.
She sounded suspicious.
Only the priestesses in our temples speak this dialect. To my countrymen, it is almost unintelligible.
Kleio thought of an excuse. Ia seemed as if she were looking at a ghost, less out of fear than morbid fascination. She hummed.
Strange.
She stepped closer to Kleio and regarded her scrutinizingly.
You don't fall under my jurisdiction, sweetheart, but you should really get that looked at.
Gently, she stroked her shoulder, down her arm. She didn't even let Kleio get a word in edgewise when she took leave with a wave before walking off as on a catwalk, leaving her standing there like a dork. She shrugged and returned her attention to her drink. It had escaped her notice how the counter at the bar was filling up. Suddenly, she was surrounded by people, as if she had attracted the party magnetically.
May you please let me pass?
She heard a timid voice behind her, a concubine of the mystic Jin Fa Shuo. She was considerably shorter than Kleio, and appeared to be a lost child amidst the tall Laxarians.
Of course. I didn't mean to get in the way.
Kleio replied, letting her through. The girl didn't reply anything. Instead, she looked furtively at Kleio, walking past her without taking her eyes off her, not until she ordered. Kleio watched as she repeatedly turned her way from the counter. The suspicion in her expression remained unchanged. She wondered if she simply felt equally observed, and the expression was just her natural way of looking. This thesis turned out to be untenable when she returned to her master with some refreshments. In an armchair, he was sucking on his pipe while she handed him the drink and went to his ear. Kleio didn't need to hear what she spoke into it. The looks of them both was enough.
They probably think I'm a spy or something.
She thought, which at the same time sounded like a joke. So conspicuous was her behavior that she made for a bad Mata Hari. Surely, a spy would be less frightened if a voice sounded behind her.
You must forgive her suspicions.
Shima spoke suddenly. The extravagance of the actress echoed in her voice, and yet she had stalked her like a predatory cat.
A young thing of your origin, conversing with her in the Aslaric language of her native land.
This woman looked straight through her.
If you are the niece of the old man, I am a were-jaguar,
She surmised, using the cultural metaphor. There was little point in denying it.
What gives me away?
Kleio wanted to know.
One look at you two side by side was enough for me,
She replied, as if shot out of a gun.
Things must have happened there, within one generation, that are impossible the Laxarian way.
She lit a stick of tobacco, took a deep drag, and blew the smoke aside with her pursed lips. She handed Kleio a martini-like glass of a dark brown brew that looked anything but appetizing, had the same ready for herself. Brown-red foam floated on the surface, and Kleio accepted it merely out of propriety. They clinked glasses. Apparently this custom existed here as well, and they both took a sip. A flood of flavor ensued in her palate. Somehow, the taste resembled that of cola, but also with a bitter note of cocoa. A spiciness of chili made itself felt in the finish. It was exceedingly bitter, and this was a taste she had not yet learned to like. Yet less bad than expected.
What is in here?
She inquired, and Shima pondered.
Don't remember exactly. It was cola, cocoa, chili, and coca, I think.
While still taking a considerable sip, which ironically she took really greedily, Kleio choked and coughed.
There's cocoa in here?
She asked incredulously.
Of course.
Shima replied with a laugh. She visibly lacked understanding of the alienation.
It's most refreshing.
Even if similarities prevailed, Kleio had to learn that things ran differently in this world.
Our Ulamali professionals drink the stuff like water. Ula what? Ulamali.
Repeated Shima perkily.
Just the most famous ball sport in the world. Don't act like you've never heard of it before, dear, just because your teams can't compete with those of my country.
Clearly came out the national pride for the merits of their athletes.
Matlar was the best before he got the injury.
She brought it up like something everyone ought to know. In turn, the cluelessness in Kleio's face had to be disconcerting to the lesbian. She showed a flair for the art of facial expressions. For the first time, she bought her performance.
You know how to express yourself fluently in lesbian, and you never heard of Ulamali?
She asked in amazement. Suddenly, she put on a broad smile that seemed a bit artificial to Kleio.
Here comes just the person to explain it to you.
She pointed past her to where her companion stood, the lesbian diplomat and one-time elite athlete, Mutlal, a Lumti, and Shima integrated him directly into the conversation.
Dearest, are you bored?
She asked bluntly.
I'm just familiarizing the dear niece of His Eminence with the peculiarities of home.
After an initial period of getting used to it, Kleio had to admit to herself that the swill was somehow becoming digestible. Her preconceptions attributed it to the cocaine, which didn't stop her from getting a refill when Shima just prepared one for him.
To the homeland, even if we are far from it.
Mutlal spoke.
Here, here.
Kleio replied, and they both looked at her as if it had been unusual.
May I ask where you learned to express yourself in lesbian?
I enjoy reading. And I do it a lot.
She fibbed.
And got a good education.
You can hear that.
Shima confirmed.
I couldn't help but overhear you talking to that woman from Shenhuan, how you communicated in her dialect, or the Alkabi. It sounded as organic as your lesbian. Respect.
She paid her tribute with a fair amount of suspicion. Kleio felt herself blush. Shima definitely smelled a rat, just didn't know what kind. Mutlal, on the other hand, just seemed intrigued by the explanation.
Who was your mentor? And in which works of lesbia did he teach you?
Briefly, she pondered what made him think that it must have been a man, before it occurred to her that, after all, she was supposed to have enjoyed a Laxarian education.
I'm terribly forgetful when it comes to names.
She was aware of just how unconvincing the message came across with the stuttering. Spontaneously, she thought about how the lie construct could be made more stable.
A few years ago, I had a riding accident and suffered a head injury. Since then,
Everything hasn't been completely present.
She asked herself how the gentry would react had she claimed she was from another world, and had learned all those languages after she was violently hit on the head. It was one of those moments when the truth sounded more absurd than some fantasy.
But the languages stayed? Fascinating,
remarked Mutlal, impressed. A glance at Shima revealed that she was less on the hook.
I know what it's like to not be the same after a life-changing event,
he continued sympathetically, lifting his loincloth up to his thigh. What started out like a suggestive gesture exposed a neat scar. Although it had healed well, the extent of the injury could be guessed, which Kleio did, slightly contorting her face in thought of the pain.
I have always been spared such wounds on the court. Unfortunately, the story of how this scar came to be is less laudable than I would like. It was a wild boar that surprised me while I was gardening.
He almost lost his leg in the process.
Shima added to the picture.
It was the end of his sports career, of course.
In exchange, I was allowed to discover my passion for plants. Ulamali was my former life. Now it's kinkwaddle.
How strange it was that some words just didn't get translated, as if her translation software failed at those moments. Ulamali, Kolagat, or
Amabellum.
Kleio's thoughts probably lacked the appropriate filler word. She almost felt guilty because she was telling them a lie, and he was talking about a real tragedy in his life to express empathy. She would have liked to tell them the truth, from a gut feeling that told her they were sincere, but she recollected herself to live with the lie. However, she wished that her magnetism would wane a bit, so she didn't have to keep explaining herself, and maintained a facade until the guests were asked into the dining room. Over 200 members of the Laxarian elite, delegates from Lisbia, Al-Kebu, and the Shenhuan Kanchao Empire, the Tauridian puppets of the Kolagat, and a completely lost, slightly intoxicated Frenchwoman gathered at the tables. The light of the chandeliers staged a motley of dishes like an impressionist painting. Delicacies served in a rainbow of culinary rarities. Fragrances of all kinds mingled to form an indefinable bouquet. Spicy, savory, from fruity and flowery to sugary sweet. By no means as frugal as the clerics of Icebat preached, the Laxarians remained faithful to the stereotypes, preaching about water and sucking from the wine barrel themselves. The latter flowed in abundance, with each course its own, while one delicacy of the Laxarian haute cuisine followed the other. 5 courses were dished up, before a brief pause for digestion, and merely the size of the portions corresponded to the Ice-Patian frugality, not so much what was contained. Candied, fried, glazed, every state of every ingredient and every composition of every flavor. Opulent and decadent were adjectives that came to Kleio's mind, rarely healthy. So it came to the 6th course where she wasn't the only one who found the cut of meat too oozing. Shima, all diva, even refused to touch the Laxarian roast.
Laxarians don't prepare their meat properly. Besides, today's not a holiday,
she said, pushing the plate away from her in disgust.
The airs and graces of an actress,
Geoff commented on the behavior.
That has less to do with my airs, and more with my faith. I am sure a man of faith, like His Eminence, will understand.
It depends entirely on to whom that faith belongs. According to Icepat, it is the right of the chosen to take from his fruits whenever they wish.
Icepat, Icepat, Icepat,
she interrupted him, bored.
Don't you ever get tired of always expressing yourself in his words?
Haunted silence fell among the hosts as she winged out the name of their saviour in such a disrespectful manner. His Eminence calmly picked up his serviette and wiped his mouth, then put it down again without a ruffle of excitement, while everyone's eyes were on him. With a steely expression, he looked straight at the lesbian. Kleio didn't think she could have withstood that look. Shima faced him with an almost challenging smile on her lips.
Any other person I would have had executed immediately after such a statement. You are fortunate to be such a feast for the eyes, and in the company of such an important man.
He pointed his hand at Mutlal. The latter tried to tell his companion with his eyes that it was advisable to be quiet, even if she disagreed with his summary of her greatest qualities, and it was against her nature to put up with such statements.
I consider myself fortunate to be a lesbian,
She said, at first not very constructively, then picked up her wine glass and raised it.
Here's to Lisbia having such strong allies as Laxaria, and a fruitful alliance.
The eminence of the collegat returned her gesture before everyone in the room imitated the toast. Those in the far corner could not possibly have known what was being toasted, but so they did. That's the way it was with such customs. In the presence of those Laxarians considered heretics, there was never really a party atmosphere. The faith of the Laxarians forbade it to do so among their own. His Eminence's mood swing stifled any approach and replaced it with oppressive silence. Only the final course, a honeyed dessert with cream topping, sweetened his austerity. He took the fork and tapped his goblet 3 times, by which he won the ear of his guests.
My distinguished sojourners,
He opened.
we have gathered under the banner of Icepat and have feasted on the fruits of his triumph. The capture of Taured is nearly accomplished. The southern cities will fall in the coming weeks and will soon belong to the Laxarian Empire. Such is the will of Icepat.
He crossed himself in the square, and so did his fellow believers.
I have gathered you together to announce the decision of the collegat, and to make an offer to the representatives of the remaining powers. Laxaria wants to withdraw from the territories of Alkebu and Shenhuan. As long as the Taurdian regions are left to us without further ado, with Lisbia, an agreement to that effect has already been reached.
He looked promptly at Mutlala Lumti. As a former national athlete, now a researcher and a diplomat, the latter became the mouthpiece of the Lisbian people, and equally enjoyed the respect of the foreigners.
Lisbia supports the annexation as long as Laxaria gives us back the northern lands.
He testified to the agreement. Kusalas Akavia, head of the clan and quite the blowhard he portrayed, felt he had to encourage the occupiers as well, under the goading gaze of his consort Magda.
As Taured's representative, I support the new government of the collegat. The economic structures will remain largely intact. Thus, with Laxarian support, we also want to take up the import and export with the realms of the Khan and Alkebu again.
Ea Tamrat of the Alkebi was content with this. Jin Fashuo, opposite, was suspicious of the matter.
How do we know that Icepat's militants will keep their part of the bargain? At the negotiating table, they may act honorably. Those present know as well as I how little honor they know apart from it. How you fight the war is utterly dishonorable.
The accusation vibrated almost tearfully.
These machines are wrong.
Between them, the air electrified and was about to discharge in a flash of lightning, before Geoff 4 surprisingly started laughing.
I realize why you see little honor in the superiority of our war machine. After all, you lack the technology. You would not hesitate for a moment to use it, should one of our machines fall into your hands.
With that, Geoff 4 displayed little diplomatic skill. His Eminence, however, had an ace up his sleeve, which Kleio failed to include, although he brought the trump card openly to the table from the start.
I did not invite the ladies and gentlemen to engage in a battle of words with them. The collegat decided to give a sign of confidence to those present. I think that you will have a different stance to our offer once we have been able to hold our demonstration.
He looked at Shima.
A performance of a special kind.
At the announcement of a stage magician, he gave the soldiers the signal by clapping, and the lights went out. A murmur went through the ranks of the guests. Even the other Laxarians had not expected the spontaneous show. At regular intervals, Laxarian guards stood by and lit torches. 2 strode up to His Eminence and illuminated the drama. All eyes looked to Geoff 4 of the Laxarian collegat, who now rather advanced to a Taurdian hierophant. The will to open their eyes was reflected in the fire of the torchbearers. Those of Kleio, at least, widened as she realized he was pointing directly at her.
Some of those present will certainly have seen through my deception. And they were entirely right. This young woman is not of my blood. Not of any of this world. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you a woman from an alien dimension.
Kleio could not understand quickly enough that she was becoming the attraction of the evening. When the soldiers were already holding her by the arms, she wanted to break away from them, but the grip of his henchmen was too strong.
What's going on?
She wanted to know, not knowing in what language she did.
What are you doing to me?
The confusion of the uninitiated increased when another Laxarian soldier stepped into the hall. The box in his hands was what set them off. It was an identical apparatus to the one used in the prison camp for confession, or the diatech as they called it. He approached her with it, and installed the device in front of her on the table, attached the same probes.
Through her, we will carry the word of Icebat beyond the borders of this world,
Geoff declared, blind in the face of conviction. These were bold, almost heretical words from the mouth of the collegiate. Every other Laxarian paid such with death.
That is why the lordships were summoned to Keltoin by the collegiate,
He confessed.
Even the most stubborn pagans will be converted, if we reveal to them the unknown spheres with the help of our science. The foundation of our triumph is united under this one roof. The glory of Icebat is inescapable. His ways lead beyond limits.
He nodded, and the soldier turned up the controls, and Kleio felt nothing. Was this supposed to be a bad joke? She stared around the room. Her lack of understanding painted itself on her made-up mask. No one showed a reaction. Everyone waited for hers. Suddenly, a tingle spread within her. At first, more like a tickle. And she had to giggle because of it. Proportionally with the setting of the controller, the chaotic emotional excitement increased. The more they turned up, the more the sensation grew. And once again, it was causality. Cause and effect in her cosmic adventure that carried Kleio beyond the imaginable. Suddenly, her body tensed, and she began to shake, more violently and more jerkily as if she was possessed. In her epileptic seizure, it went black before her eyes. Blackness settled over her eyes. Kleio was struck by the realization like a lightning bolt, a black flash that came over her like a shadow. If guests from the 3 other corners of this world were arriving because of her, then weeks, if not months, had passed inside the box, before the frequency of the machine found the blackness inside her. Stay tuned for weekly chapters. Like, share, and subscribe for more wacky adventures. We thank you for your support.